Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we got a very interesting video here. This is another pre-recorded video here that I'm going to be posting over the holiday break. In today's video, we look at 10 teams who have never won the Stanley Cup. We look at their histories, how long it's been for these teams since they've been made into the league that they have not won a cup, and we'll see which team I personally think could break that streak next. We saw the Knights and the Panthers do over the past couple of years. A couple of years before that, we saw the Blues and the Caps do it. Which are the next teams who have never won a Stanley Cup to win a Stanley Cup? We'll touch on all these things coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do it with all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget the subscribe button down below. Don't forget to comment on the road to 1,000 subscribers. But if we can hit 600 by the new year, I'd be happy with that. And don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. So in today's video, we're looking at teams who have never won the Stanley Cup. There are 10 NHL teams out of the 32 teams in the NHL who have never won a cup, including a couple of teams who never even been to a Stanley Cup final, and one team who's had very little playoff success. So we'll touch on all these teams. So we're going to start off with the lower ranked teams, the teams who have gone the longest without winning a Stanley Cup. Now most of these teams, 8 of them, are from the 1991 expansion and beyond, so they're only been around for just over 30 years or somewhere below that. But there are 2 franchises who were included in the 1970 expansion who have never won a Stanley Cup, unfortunately, have a combined 0-5 record in Stanley Cup finals, and that is the Buffalo Sabres and the Vancouver Canucks. These 2 teams were both made in 1970. I think they were the second expansion after the Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, St. Louis expansion, like that first expansion. They were the expansion after that. And teams after them who were expanded in, who have won Stanley Cups. Jersey's won Stanley Cups. Caps have won Stanley Cups. Owls have won Stanley Cups. There were a lot of teams who were expansions after the Buffalo Sabres and Vancouver Canucks who have won cups. These 2 franchises seem to be cursed, and even this season, like I'm recording this video on December 19th, the Buffalo Sabres, they've just fired Jarmo Kekalainen. They won, I think, a couple of games in a row, but they are not looking overly good, and Vancouver just traded Quinn Hughes. So like, these 2 franchises seem to be cursed and about not winning Stanley Cups. So given the fact that they were made in 1970, this is year, I think, 55 of each team's franchise. Both franchises have actually made 29 playoff appearances in their 55-year existence. So that's just a little bit above 50%, so not too bad about making the playoffs. Neither team except for Buffalo, who continually misses the playoffs in the past decade. So very interesting note there. The Buffalo Sabres have been able to make it to 6 conference final appearances over their 55-year existence. This is more than any other team we're going to be talking about today. So very interesting note there. They actually made quite a bit of conference final appearances. The Canucks have only made 3 conference final appearances. However, the Canucks are 3 for 3. They've been to 3 conference final appearances, won 3 conference final appearances, and made 3 Stanley Cup finals. Well, for the Buffalo Sabres, they have a 2-4 record in conference finals. They've been to 2 Stanley Cup finals, and like I said, both these teams have never won a Stanley Cup. The Canucks lost, I think it was back in the 80s to the Islanders, in 94 to the Rangers, and then most recently in 2011 to the Boston Bruins. Well, the Buffalo Sabres lost, I think it was in the 70s to the Philadelphia Flyers in the Stanley Cup final, and then in 1999 against Dallas. So it's been quite a while for both these teams to make it to the Stanley Cup final, and with the way things are going right now, I don't know when the next time these 2 teams will even make the playoffs. So very interesting note there, but the Buffalo Sabres and Vancouver Canucks have gone a long time without winning a Stanley Cup. The next team will be the 1990 expansion, and that is the San Jose Sharks. That kicked off the, I think, 10 years of expanding 9 teams, relocating a couple of teams. The San Jose Sharks were the first expansion of that era. So very interesting to note there. They've been around for, I think, 35 years now. So they've had a good chunk of time at the NHL level. They've actually already made the playoffs 21 times in their 35-year existence. Now, they haven't made the playoffs in the last 6 years. And they're still a team who looks a little bit better this year. I don't think they'll make the playoffs, but I could see them get back in the playoffs in the next year or 2. So the Sharks are trending in the right direction, but they have made the playoffs a good chunk of time. Around a third of their existence, they've been able to make it into into the playoffs. So very interesting to note there. They have made 5 conference final appearances. So they've actually made more conference final appearances than the Vancouver Canucks have, which is very interesting. They are 1-4 in those conference final appearances. They were only able to win 1 conference final appearance that they've made, and that was back in 2016 when they went to their lone Stanley Cup final appearance against the Pittsburgh Penguins, when the Penguins won the first of back-to-back Stanley Cups. So that's the closest the San Jose Sharks got. I think it was a 6-game series, so they got 2 wins away from the Stanley Cup, their first ever Stanley Cup. So remember, that San Jose Sharks team continued to do really good in the 2010s, towards the end of the 2010s, and then in the 2020s, they've not been in existence in the playoffs. So very interesting to note there. Like I said, they're a team on the rise, but at this point in time, I'm not sure if they're a playoff team this year. The next team is the 1991 Ottawa Senators. They were the second iteration of the Ottawa Senators. They were brought back into the league. They've been in the NHL for, I think, 34 years now, so they've been there for a good chunk of time too. They've made 4 less playoff appearances than the Sharks have, so they've made 17 playoff appearances in 34 years. So about half of the seasons they've been in, they've been able to make the playoffs. They're just coming off of an 8-year playoff drought. So very interesting note there. They've made 3 conference final appearances. Only 1 time did they win the conference final and make it to the Stanley Cup final, and that was back in the 07-08 season. I think it was actually beating the Buffalo Sabres in the conference final, as they took them down to go on to advance the Anaheim Ducks, when they wound up losing to the Ducks in the 07-08 Stanley Cup final. So once again, it's been a while for the Senators to be in a Stanley Cup final too. But their team is on the up and up. I know they haven't had the greatest of starts in December, but I still believe they're going to be a playoff team this year. I'm not sure if they're going to go to the Stanley Cup final, but I do think this team is headed in the right direction. I think San Jose is probably a couple of years away from contending for a cup. Buffalo and Vancouver, not sure what's going to happen with them. But also a team who I think in the next 2 to 4 years could easily see them making a Stanley Cup final appearance at some point, potentially even winning it. They have a good young team, a good young core. I really do believe this Ottawa Senators team is a really good team, and even though they don't have too much success in their history, I do think the Senators team will be a dominant team in years to come. So very interesting note there, but that's the 4th team who hasn't won a Stanley Cup. The 5th team who hasn't won a Stanley Cup is the 1998 Nashville Predators. They came in the 1998 season, so that was, I think, 7 years after the Ottawa Senators. They were the first iteration of teams in Nashville. They had a couple of really solid teams, especially in the mid-2010s. They were killing in the Central Division. They've made 16 playoff appearances throughout their 27-year history. So very interesting note there. The Nashville Predators have only made 1 conference final appearance. They won that. That was back in 2017. Yes, the year after the San Jose Sharks made their first Stanley Cup final appearance, the Nashville Predators made their first ever Stanley Cup final appearance. After taking out Anaheim in the conference final, they played the Pittsburgh Penguins, who won the second half of their back-to-back cup wins. So the Penguins in back-to-back years took down 2 teams who made their first ever Stanley Cup final appearance. So that is the one and only time the Nashville Predators have ever been to a Stanley Cup final. Now, early 2010 to late 2010 Nashville Predators were a dominant team, a team no one wanted to play. The past couple of years, they've been able to sneak into the playoffs a couple of times over the past 5 years, but they never really were a threat. And now they're one of the worst teams in the NHL. So I don't know what they need to fix, but I think this is a team who could miss the playoffs for the next couple of years. I think they're still going to be a ways away from contending for their first ever Stanley Cup. So very interesting note there, but the 1998 expansion, Nashville Predators are the 5th team who has never won a Stanley Cup. The 6th team is the Atlanta/Winnipeg franchise that kicked off in the 1999 season as the Atlanta Thrashers and then relocated to Winnipeg Jets in 2011 to become the second iteration of the Winnipeg Jets. So the Thrashers, in their, I think, 11 or 12-year history, made the playoffs once and got swept. So they really never had much playoff success. The Jets have made the playoffs 8 times in the last 13 seasons, I think. So they've actually had some pretty good success making the playoffs. They haven't had a ton of success making noise in those playoffs. They've been to 1 conference final. That was back in the 17-18 season when they lost to Vegas in 5 games. They are one of the few franchises who has never been to a Stanley Cup final, not even appeared in one. The Sharks, the Senators, the Predators, the Canucks, the Sabres, they've all at least been to a Stanley Cup final. The Atlanta Thrashers/Winnipeg Jets have never been to a Stanley Cup final. So interesting note there, like they're not doing overly great this year, but I still think this team is built to be a contender in the NHL. If Hellebuck can find his way in the playoffs, like that team could be scary if they made the playoffs. So I do think the Jets could still be a cup contender for the next couple of seasons. I know they're not having the greatest of seasons this year, but I still believe in the Winnipeg Jets, but they are the sixth team that we're talking about here who has never won a Stanley Cup. Now the next four teams we're going to talk about have all been expanded in the 2000s. We're going to talk about the two teams who expanded in 2000 first, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets and Minnesota Wild. These two franchises have had basically the least amount of success out of all the NHL franchises. This is year 25 for both teams. For the Wild, they've at least had a little bit more success than the Jackets. They've made 14 playoff appearances. So 14 appearances in 25 years is not terrible for the Minnesota Wild. Like, it could be a whole bunch worse, but I mean, that's like making the playoffs every 3 out of 5 years, which isn't overly bad. So the Wild know how to make the playoffs. They've had one conference final appearance. I think that was in year 3 or year 4 back in the 03 playoffs when they played, I can't remember who, I think it was Anaheim, but they lost in that conference final appearance. Them, just like the Jets/Thrashers, are a team who has never been to a Stanley Cup final. Now, they made a trade for Quinn Hughes. They have consistently been a solid team to make the playoffs. I think they're starting to get a little bit scarier. I think with Quinn Hughes, with some other additions they made, keeping Kaprizov, this Wild team is probably built to win a Stanley Cup now. I think out of all the teams we're going to be talking about here, the Wild might be the closest of these 10 teams to win a Stanley Cup. I know they're in a very tough Central Division, but I picked them as my preseason Stanley Cup champions. I recently picked them as my Christmas break Stanley Cup champions. I think they have a very likely shot at potentially ending the drought this year. I think it's a very likely possibility, even though they're in a division that has Colorado and Dallas. So very interesting note there, but I think that the Minnesota Wild are probably the closest team to ending their cup drought, and I could see them bring a cup to Minnesota in the next couple of years. So very interesting note there. Then you have the lesser of the two 2000 franchises, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets, who have had little to no success throughout their entire franchise's history. They've made the playoffs a combined 6 times in their franchise's history, and they have won 1 playoff series. They've never been to a conference final, they've never been to a Stanley Cup final, and they've never won a Stanley Cup. So like, they've had minimal success in their entire franchise history. Like, this is year 25, and they've only had 1 playoff series win. Like, I can't think of a worse franchise in the entire NHL. The Jackets, they're on the up and up. They're not doing too well this year, but that's because it's a very tough and competitive Eastern Conference. But if they can sneak into a playoff spot, like, I could see them do some damage this year. I don't think they're cup final ready this year, but I think if they continue to build what they're building over there, maybe in the next like 2 to 4 years, maybe something similar to Ottawa, I could see them be a cup contender in a couple of years' time, maybe have some playoff success that they never seem to have. So very interesting note there, but the Jackets have been a very, very bad franchise throughout their entire history, and because of that, they can't seem to put it together. So that team is the 8th team we're talking about here, and they can't seem to find ways. The other 2 teams we really have to take into consideration because they've only been around for a couple of years. That is the Seattle Kraken and the Utah Mammoth. Now, Utah was originally Arizona, but they're technically calling it an expansion team instead of a relocated team. So even though they were from Arizona, they still are considered an expansion team, even if they were part of Arizona/Winnipeg, those other 2 franchises. They've never been to a Stanley Cup final. Both the Jets, the original Jets, and the Coyotes never made it to a Stanley Cup final. I think they've been to a couple of conference finals, but I don't think they ever even made it to a Stanley Cup final. The Utah Mammoth are coming off their first ever season, so once again, you have to take that into consideration, but they've not made the playoffs. They've not made a conference final appearance, Stanley Cup final appearance, but once again, they are in a very young state at this point in time in their franchise history, so you got to take that with a grain of salt. Same sort of thing with Seattle. They've been in there for 4 seasons. They were an expansion team in the 2021 season. They made 1 playoff appearance. They were 1 win away from their first ever conference final back a couple of years ago. I think it was in the 2022 or 2023 playoffs. So they've had some success, but they've been mostly a bomb-dwelling team too. But once again, they are an expansion team, so they have to be a little bit patient too. So very interesting out there, but I think with Seattle, with Utah, given the fact Seattle's only 4 years old, and Utah too, you got to take it with a grain of salt at this point in time. So very interesting note there, but those are the 10 teams who have never won a Stanley Cup: Utah, Seattle, Minnesota, Columbus, Winnipeg, Nashville, Ottawa, San Jose, Vancouver, Buffalo. Buffalo. And Utah, Seattle, Minnesota, Columbus, Winnipeg have never even been to a Stanley Cup final. So if I had to pick teams who I could easily see winning a cup in maybe the next 5 years, I think Minnesota tops it. They are probably the best team suited to end their Stanley Cup playoff drought. I think following them, Ottawa and Winnipeg would be the next two. Not only will they be able to bring a cup back to Canada, but they will be able to win their first ever Stanley Cup. I think those two are also very close to winning a Stanley Cup, or at least being in the Stanley Cup conversation. I think maybe the fifth year, the fourth or fifth year in the next 5 years, I could see Columbus and maybe San Jose, maybe even Utah be in that conversation. I think those guys all have really solid young teams, and I don't think they're Stanley Cup ready this year. I think in a couple of years' time they could be. So I think right now, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Minnesota, if they had good runs in the postseason, I could see any three of those teams wind up making the Stanley Cup run to win their Stanley Cup. And I think in a couple of years' time, Utah, San Jose, and Columbus could be in that conversation too. But I think we still have to wait a little bit and figure out what Buffalo, Vancouver, Nashville, and Seattle are sort of doing. So very interesting note there, but I'll let you guys thoughts. Are you surprised that there's still 10 teams in the NHL who have never won a Stanley Cup? And of those 10 teams, which team do you think will be the first one to bring their first ever cup to their city? Definitely your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk for today. We're going to like this video, and if you'd like to subscribe below, thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to without all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget the subscribe button down below. Don't forget to comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. Also a blog with news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so you check that out. I'll link to the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.